Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In the previous lecture, we talked about the beginnings of the Cold War, located primarily in the wartime conferences in the late stages of World War II. In this lecture, we'll continue our discussion of the deepening Cold War in the years immediately following World War II, and what impact those developments had on America's policies in Southeast Asia. I mentioned in the previous lecture that one of America's primary goals in the aftermath of World War II was how best to secure a stable economy in the very unstable world in the aftermath of the war. One cog in this plan was to secure the market in China. 1 billion Chinese consumers would certainly lift the American economy. The problem was that in 1945, China found itself in the midst of a civil war that dated back to the 1930s. There, a communist minority struggled under Mao Zedong to overthrow the nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek. The United States sent aid to Chiang, but much of the aid was siphoned off by corrupt members of Chiang's government. The repression and corruption of his government increasingly alienated the peasants, who were drawn to Mao's movement, which found itself growing. The United States attempted to weaken Mao by separating him from Moscow, not understanding that the two were already independent of each other. In 1945, for considerable territory in the post-war settlement, Stalin agreed to negotiate with Chiang rather than Mao. Stalin hoped merely to continue the chaos in China and not have to worry about a powerful, unified China as his neighbor. Despite these efforts, Mao's movement continued to grow, and Chiang could not solidify his hold on the country. Truman even sent soldiers, eventually numbering some 100,000, to support Chiang. With the end of World War II, Mao's troops were strengthened when retreating Japanese forces left huge stocks of weapons and ammunition in Manchuria, which Mao's men were now able to seize. The United States was left in a quandary. They either had to virtually completely prop up Chiang and hope that he could prevail, or leave Chiang knowing that Mao and the communists would prevail. By 1946, America's commitment to Chiang was waning, and it seemed likely that China would fall to communism. Maintaining the open door in China had failed. There were also early Cold War showdowns in Turkey and Iran. During World War II, the Allies had jointly occupied Iran with the understanding that 6 months after the war they would remove their troops. As the deadline approached, Stalin increased the Soviet presence in Iran. Only strong urging from the United Nations eventually led Stalin to withdraw his forces from Iran, as originally agreed, though the Soviets maintained close economic ties to Iran. In Turkey, Stalin hoped to negotiate an agreement to allow the Soviets to establish military bases there. This was overlooking the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, important crossroads in the region. During this showdown in Turkey, U.S. Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson advised that the United States confront the Soviets now, before the fall of Turkey led to the fall of the Middle East, then India, then China. Even at this early juncture of the Cold War, Acheson was describing a sort of domino theory, which would become critical under Eisenhower and later administrations. The domino theory assumes that the Soviets are driven by expansion and will not stop unless forced to do so. In fact, we now know that that wasn't likely the case. But in 1946 and 47, Truman and others were not interested in disputing the theory. As Truman said, "We might as well find out whether the Russians were bent on world conquest now as in 5 or 10 years." The United States responded by escalating its military presence in the Mediterranean, including sending the most powerful aircraft carrier, the Franklin D. Roosevelt, to patrol the region. Again, the Soviet presence backed down. In early 1946, the Cold War also escalated into a war of words between the two sides. In a famous February 1946 speech at the Bolshoi Theater, Stalin announced that capitalism and communism were on a collision course. War was inevitable as long as capitalism existed. In the United States, the speech was interpreted by many as a declaration of war. Winston Churchill responded in a speech in Fulton, Missouri on March 5th. This was Truman's hometown, and it's known as the Iron Curtain speech. Churchill famously said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." He also suggested that Europe, outside of the United Nations, form an informal organization to, quote, reorder the world. Obviously, the Soviet Union would not be part of that organization. Stalin decried the speech and compared Churchill to Hitler, and again suggested that war was near. The Cold War jockeying was starting to heat up. The Soviet Union continued to distance itself from the other former allies. It rejected an offer from the United States for a $1 billion loan, which the United States had extended in late 1944 as the war was still winding to its close. The Soviets could not be bought at that juncture for any price and chose to avoid the offer, which would come with strings attached. They also refused to become a member of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, new organizations, again seeing them as attempts by the Americans to buy off their independence. The Soviets would. And in the summer of 1946, Stalin announced a new 5-year plan, which included eliminating Western influences and spreading communist dogma. Such things indicated to policymakers in the United States that the Soviet Union had become a menace. For his part, Harry Truman was relatively quiet during these early months of the Cold War. He was new to the presidency and chose to observe, learn, and consult with his advisors rather than dive into any policy too quickly that might backfire later on. In 1946 and into 1947, Truman was under fire from his critics, who argued that he was a weak leader and needed to take charge of the situation. His approval rating sagged into the mid-30s. The midterm elections of 1946 were a disaster for Truman. The Republicans gained a solid majority in both houses and included some of the more powerful Republicans of the era, including Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, who would become the great cheerleader for the Red Scare in the years to follow. By the end of 1946, the liberals had begun to fight back, enunciating a policy that would begin to strengthen the wobbly Truman administration. He rebounded again, enough to win re-election in 1948, before his approval ratings began to sag once again. How did FDR and Truman view Southeast Asia in the aftermath of the war? Well, FDR was concerned that continued colonization was certain to lead to war in the future, and also worried that Asian markets and elsewhere would reject the Americans and Europeans if they continued imperialism. So FDR adopted a largely anti-imperialist stance during the war. FDR and his advisors developed a plan of international trusteeship to oversee the former colonies in the post-war years. Under this plan, trustees from the developed nations, which would be chosen by the United Nations, would oversee development in the former colonies until they were deemed fit for independence. They also envisioned cooperative efforts in maintaining world peace after the war, overseen by Great Britain and Russia in Europe and the United States and China in Asia. Secretary of State Cordell Hull and others did not envision a preeminent role for France in the post-war world. France had collapsed quickly during the war and contributed to the arms race in Europe before Hitler's conquest. Accordingly, neither FDR nor his advisors thought that Indochina should be returned to France after the war, but rather it should be overseen by international trustees. As the war progressed, and as Great Britain objected to the colonies being removed, the United States changed its position somewhat, so that only colonial powers of enemy nations would be overseen by international trustees. The post-war role of France began to grow more important as the expansionist intentions of Russia became more obvious in the later stages of the war. FDR grew convinced after his discussions with Stalin during the wartime conferences that the Soviets intended to dominate Poland, much of Europe, and possibly other areas after the war. France would be an important check on this communist expansion in both Europe and in their former colonies. Thus, FDR began to soften his stance that Indochina should not be returned to France. He began to believe that French control in the region could be the first stopgap against communist expansion in Asia. On March 13, 1945, in Paris, French General Charles de Gaulle said to an American diplomat, "The Russians are advancing apace. When Germany falls, they will be upon us. If the public here comes to realize that you are against us in Indochina, there will be terrific disappointment, and nobody knows to what that will lead. We do not want to become communist. We do not want to fall into the Russian orbit, but I hope that you do not push us into it." You might call it blackmail, but shortly thereafter, FDR agreed that he would not impede French desires to re-establish their colonies in Indochina. Harry Truman, assuming the presidency in the last months of the war and in the peace after, was concerned at having a weakened France in the post-war world, which was rapidly descending into the Cold War. Truman, who was not concerned at all with Vietnamese history or interests, was more interested in having a powerful and solvent France. So the United States did not honor Vietnamese independence at the end of the war, instead supporting the restoration of French rule. Recall that we've already discussed this process in previous lectures. The United States tacitly supported initial French efforts to resume control in Indochina, not objecting when the French used American funds intended to rebuild the French economy to support the war in Indochina. It also allowed French to use American ships and other military supplies in waging the war. Aid to the French thus began to increase as the Cold War deepened in 1946 and 47. The Americans allowed France to channel money intended to strengthen France itself to the war in Indochina. And that is where the United States begins to enter the picture. Leaders in the United States, especially Secretary of State Dean Acheson, were determined to stop the spread of communism. We're going to discuss the policy of containment in the next lecture. While the Soviet Union was not involved at all in the Vietnamese affair, American leaders simply could not accept an independent Vietnam with communist leanings. Truman and Acheson believed that Ho Chi Minh winning in Vietnam would spark a communist revolution in all of Indochina, which would inspire the spread of communism to other neighboring nations. And so, in the late 1940s, the United States began offering aid to the French. In our next lecture, we'll continue discussion of the Cold War backdrop to events in Southeast Asia, primarily the policies of containment and the Marshall Plan.